Hello and welcome to The Reassembler with me, James May. It's a show where we put things back together again. That's it. It's not a familiar bit. It is only when these objects are laid out in hundreds of bits and then slowly reassembled, dun 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 dun, that you can truly understand and appreciate how they work, yeah, and just how ingenious they are. Deep joy. And if painstakingly putting hundreds of pieces back together again, oh God, it's electrics, wasn't hard enough, fantastic, we've used all the bits. I then have to find out, oh yes, if they'll work. No, it's all come apart. Now, today on the table we have the 147 components that make up an electric guitar. And as long as they stay there like that, laid out beautifully, there is no danger that anybody will attempt to play Stairway to Heaven. However, I am going to put it back together and take the risk. And we will start, even though this should normally happen in the middle of the performance, by taking it to the bridge. This is the bridge plate, there. That is the trem block, securing screws. All this will go together into a rather pleasing and shiny sub-assembly. Now, as usual on this show, I don't have an exploded diagram for the electric guitar, although I do know roughly what one looks like and how it works. So, this is the bridge. The strings go over the bridge. This is the trem block, which mounts underneath and is connected to the lever that you can pull to make it go wow, wow, wow. And these saddles allow you to minutely adjust the position of the strings relative to the neck, because the neck has a slight curve in it, so the strings in the middle have to be slightly higher than the strings at either side. This is a screw and forget sort of operation. Well, I think once I've screwed this together, it won't be unscrewed again until the guitar is completely disassembled. I'm going to tell you something absolutely fascinating. Really fascinating. This is a Japanese-made guitar. It's a replica of a Fender, but it's made by a Japanese company. And these, you would say, are Phillips screws. Agreed, because they've got a crosshead in, but they're not posi-drive because they haven't got the little indentations between the slots. However, if you look very closely, you will see, look at the top there. Can you see there is a very, very tiny center punch mark? You can see that. That means that isn't a Phillips pattern screw. It means it's JIS, or Japanese Industry Standard. And it's an important difference because the Phillips screwdriver was invented primarily for the American automotive manufacturing industry. And the point of it is that the shape is designed such that the operator didn't have to worry about exactly how tight he did the screw up. This tool could be powered and it would automatically jump out of the screw when the right torque was reached. Now, the Japanese came up with a slightly different pattern, which means that if you use a Phillips-headed screwdriver, such as this one, and a Japanese industry standard screw, you will largely get away with it, but you will also tend to chew it up because the profile of the slot is slightly different. Japanese industry standard screwdrivers are actually surprisingly difficult to get hold of in Europe. But, and how surprised will you be at this, I have 3 of them here in my toolbox because I spend quite a bit of my sad spare time fiddling around with small Japanese motorcycles from the early 1960s, which had Japanese industry standard crosshead screws in them. And if you don't have the right screwdriver, you end up chewing them up, which is why you see a lot of those old bikes with knackered screws in the crankcases. Look at that. That's a Japanese industry standard screwdriver fitting beautifully in that screw. Just out of interest, I mean, it's a small difference when you're doing this. It does make a difference with things like the cases of a motorcycle engine, but if I put it on the Phillips screwdriver, it's not quite solid. There's a bit of, can you see? It's trying to come out. Use Japanese industry standard, solid as a rock. Most people don't know that, and it is true that if you look at a lot of old Hondas and Yamahas and things from that 1960s, 70s period, they have horribly chewed up crankcase screws. The screws were rather soft anyway, the ones the Japanese made. They did that deliberately so you didn't over-tighten them. But if you combine that with the incorrectly shaped screwdriver head, you end up with stuff that you're forever having to drill out because it's been knackered by amateurs who don't understand about JIS. You know, the world is full of Philistines. These screws that secure, oh, that was risky, the saddles to the bridge plate are all of the same length. We're talking about a fine-tuning device here, but there's a spring between the screw and the saddle itself in there, and the 6 springs that I have here are of 3 different lengths. So there's 2 medium ones, 2 long ones, and 2 short ones. So the order of the springs would be going from the left, and the lowest string, short, medium, long, short, medium, long. And now I'm wondering, is it better to put the little grub screws into the saddles first? I think it probably is, if only loosely. So I'm going to do that. There are 6 strings and hence 6 saddles, but 2 grub screws in each one, so you're going to have to watch me put 12 of these in loosely, I'm afraid. That one, short grub screws, short spring. Medium spring. Becca, will you leave my toolbox alone? So we have the trem block, the bridge plate, the saddles, and the adjusting screws, and the springs. See? It's nice. Like it. Right, these are the pickups, the thing that make this an electric guitar rather than just an acoustic guitar. And obviously some screws and springs. And these mount not onto the body of the guitar, as you might imagine, but onto this, the scratch plate, along with some other things that we'll be getting later. This is the scratch plate. I'm just scratching off some of the cack that's attached to it from many years of fingers twiddling these knobs. Right, there you go. Now the pickups. Pickups are quite interesting if you're interested in that sort of thing. They are the heart of the instrument. They are what makes it an electric guitar rather than simply a guitar, an acoustic guitar. The way they work, let's see if I can find a way of making this reasonably simple. They are a magnet, or a series of magnets, with copper wire wound around them. I can demonstrate that they're magnets because that screw sticks to it. And you might remember from physics, if you ever paid attention, that if you move a wire in a magnetic field in a coil, you will get a current, an EMF. And this is really how the guitar works. The string vibrates and generates a very tiny current inside the coil. And the size of that current is dependent on the amplitude of the string's vibration, how far it moves, and the frequency, how quickly it's moving. And that is then effectively producing an electric note, which is amplified by the big stack of Marshalls. Other types of amplifier are available. And then that comes out as Motorhead or whatever. And I've got a spare coil here so that I can show you. But if I peel off the protective tape, you will see the copper coils. There are something like 6,000 turns of very fine copper wire on there. In fact, the total length of the copper wire in the 3 pickups is about, I did this calculation earlier on, it's about 2.6 kilometres of wire. So if you joined the 3 wires end to end and stretched them out, you'd be able to fill 3 double-decker buses the size of a swimming pool and the area of Wales, which would be visible from outer space. We can't use that one because I've effectively ruined it doing that. The pickups are essentially the same, but they've got different length bits of wire attached to them because they have different positions in the body of the instrument. So that's the longest one, so that will go there. The shortest one will go here. They have a cover on them. Screws will go through the scratch plate, like so. And then on the other side, there is a spring, So when you mount the pickup to the scratch plate, it goes on the screw like so, but there's the spring in between, which means that by making tiny movements of the screw, you can adjust the position of the pickup relative to the string, i.e. the height. Turn it up that way. You can see that's effectively an adjustment. Yeah? Watching someone attach pickups to a scratch plate is like waiting for the end of a Mark Knopfler guitar solo. So let's not. In the very early electric guitars, which were sort of prototypes really, the pickups were above the strings. They were almost like two horseshoe magnets. I mean, the effect was exactly the same. It's just that by putting them underneath the strings, apart from making it all much neater, it allows for these various adjustments to be made. It's just altogether neater. But the idea of electric amplification by this method has been understood since the late 19th century. The electric guitar really became quite a big thing post-World War II, and is generally credited in America, certainly, as being the thing that saved us from a plague of ukuleles, which had become a very popular instrument before that. There were ukulele bands everywhere. I mean, the idea is absolutely abominable. But thanks to enthusiasm for the electric guitar, people stopped playing the ukulele, so we can thank it for that at the very least. And yeah, it's worth pointing out as well that this is a pure electric guitar. If it's not plugged into an amplifier, you can barely hear it. It does make a noise, but it's a very faint little tinkling. You can't really play it acoustically.
After an hour and 40 minutes of exhilarating reassembly, we have attached the bridge plate and the string saddles to the trem block, and the pickups are in place. Now I need the potentiometers, the pots. These will control the guitar's tone and volume.
I'm not going to take the knobs, because pushing the knobs on will be a rather joyous moment that we should save until the end. So let's take the switch assembly out and contemplate it. You can tell by the way it's joined together what the relationship is. Volume, tone, tone. The switch of the pickups in there. What I did earlier whilst we were laying the bits of the guitar out is to just open up the little tabs on this pot. This is the volume control, just so that you can see inside, get a bit of an idea how it works. Now these are off-the-shelf sort of components, these sort of things. I've got to be careful because it was already soldered together and I didn't want to break that, but there you are. You can see this slider running around. So if you imagine that the electricity, there's off, you feel the little click. Electricity comes in at one end of that strip, and as you slide the copper contact around, the amount of strip that the electricity goes through increases, so the resistance increases. So it becomes a volume switch. Does that make sense? Each switch, each pot, has two spacers on it. Keep all the soldered gubbins and so on clear of the underneath of the scratch plate, and the tabs and everything else that would snag and make it sit unevenly and offend everybody's. I've put 3 on there. Failed. And then, right, we've got to line everything up here. So the switch, the tone pickup control switch will go through there, and then volume through there, and control 1 through there, and tone control 2. Get a couple of these shallow nuts on loosely, then we know it can't fall apart, then we can wave it around. And now 2 screws to secure. Interestingly, given the drivel I was talking earlier on about Japanese industry standard screws, these ones aren't. These appear to be regular Phillips pattern. Move the screwdriver with the right there. Not necessary to do this sort of thing up really ridiculously tightly. Apart from anything else, you might crack a plastic scratch plate. It's time to break out the little used and rather despicable bone spanner. Many of you will have had one of these as something that you were given with your bicycle to ensure that you could never put it back together again, because they are fairly hopeless, but it'll do for this. Right, now we're going to have to do some soldering somewhere under here. Let me just see if I can work this out. So that's volume, tone and tone. So tone would, oh god, it's electrics. Right, the pickup switch is a 3-way 5-place switch.
Which is a good thing, because the 3-way 5-place switch is my favourite kind of switch. But it's a bit of a sod to solder.
Soldering is one of those things that is technically impossible for one person to do, because anybody who does it regularly will tell you you actually need 3 arms to solder. But what I do have that helps me a bit is this. This was a birthday present a few years ago. It's a sort of soldering help kit. It has a nice pair of reverse action tweezers to hold the wires in fiddly places. You've got to be very careful as you solder onto the back of something like that, not to hold the soldering iron there for any longer than you absolutely have to. A few seconds, ideally, at the most, in fact, because otherwise you will heat that component up and then you could do some damage inside. There is, for example, a plastic piece in the middle that it rotates around. If you got that too hot, it would melt slightly and then the whole thing would jam up. I've got to be honest, I don't particularly like soldering. I like it when it works, when it doesn't, I hate it. I am going to use my tweezers because it should mean that you can see what's happening better. Now I'm trying to get away, hang on, because that's quite a low wattage soldering iron for sort of mending toys and the like. I'm hoping to get away with just remelting the bit of old solder that's on there. It's not ideal, to be honest, but let's see. It's not going to work, is it? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Doesn't like it, Skipper. No, that's not bad. Right, so that, let's put those to one side. I'm hoping I can make that end of that survive on that first tab there. Okay, that was pickup 1, that is pickup 2. Do we like that? There you go, there's the scratch plate complete. We've just got 2 wires left to join onto the jack plug socket, and we'll put the knobs on, but we'll do that later because that's nice. Right, T. Right, we will take the springs, the plate, and the 2 screws required for the trem bar, and also these 6 screws which secure the bridge plate to the body, which means if I just take those over to the bench, we can come back and get, obviously the most significant bit, remove it very carefully, the body. Front, back. Right, because this is a valuable thing and very shiny, I always carry a pillowcase around with me. Whose pillowcase is this? That's disgusting. That's correct, that. I always carry an old pillowcase around with me. Right, we're going to start on the back, and we are going to fit this plate and these springs, which will connect ultimately to this. There is a wire on there which goes through there. We'll worry about that later. But that basically prevents nasty crackling noises. So the nasty crackling noise being made by the band is uncorrupted. Okay, so should we leave it at that for the moment? That leaves room for adjustment, yes? I think this probably makes sense at this point to turn the body over, put in the bridge plate, and put in the screws. The great thing about the guitar is that it's portable, obviously. It's, even if you need a small amplifier, it's reasonably self-contained. You can play the whole music on the one instrument. The downside of it is, it's one of they're a bit like drum kits in a way. A lot of people say they're a drummer, but what they really are is a drum kit owner, which is not the same thing. It's in the way that if I bought a Formula One car, I wouldn't be a Formula One driver, I would be a man who happens to own an old Formula One car. It's a different thing. Rebecca, is it really worth even having you here? I have put all of the screws into the bridge plate, which aren't tight. They're nipped up, but they allow a small amount of movement in that, which it needs to have, obviously, to produce the tremolo effect. I'm going to flip the body back over again. So you can have up to 5 springs on this. This guitar has 3 springs. Depends how much effect you want, what sort of player you are, and so on. I'm going to go, it's a bit of a guess really, for the middle and the 2 extreme positions. I'm also going to change my mind about that and put the spring above the wire. That's quite difficult with my gammy arm, but this being essentially a motorcycle restorer's toolbox, I have... Does anybody know what that is?
A hook.
It's technically a spring puller. It's for pulling springs, because it has a nice thin end for easing out. You can pull springs and lever springs around with a screwdriver. It's another of those many thousands of jobs to which a screwdriver can be put inappropriately, but then you often can't get it out. With a proper spring puller, such as this is, you can drop it in and then the end comes out, you see. Right, so that, I would say, looks quite promising. It still looks like a guitar, so I don't think I've messed anything up particularly. We have a choice now. We can put the neck on, which makes it a bit more unwieldy, or we can put the scratch plate on and do the last bit of wiring, but that makes it a bit more vulnerable. I think once the neck is on, it becomes a little bit Laurel and Hardy walking around with a long plank of wood type thing, you know, I'll say. And over here we see, and then the cameraman's teeth are gone, and then I can say, if you look at that end, you know, and then Rebecca's face is all smashed in, let's put the scratch plate on and do a bit of wiring. Now that's going to go there, and those wires are going to pass through that hole and be soldered on to the jack plug socket, and this wire, which is the other end of the earthing bit from the trem bar arrangement, has to be soldered onto, let's have a think about that. I'm guessing it would go on the volume pot. But that means I've got to do it like, oh, God, I hate this. Hate soldering. What's that?
Extremely necessary.
Well, I'm just cleaning up a bit where I'm going to solder it, because
That is nails on a blackboard.
is it?
It really
Yeah,
is.
it's really
It doesn't bother me. It may be possible here, with a bit of, no, hang on, a bit of cleverness to use the special soldering tweezers as the third arm I covered for soldering, because I can, just watch me melt the finish on the guitar case doing this. I can then feed. The soldering iron isn't powerful enough, is it? Yes, it is. There you go. That's tinning. That's nice. Okay. Now, is it going to be... It's going to go... I don't want to put any strain on it, so it should be... like that, I would say. Okay, that'll do, comes the cry of the perfectionist down the ages. So, what we can now do, we can feed the wires through the hole to go onto the jack socket, the thing that connects the essentially private electromagnetic activity of the guitar with the amplified world of rock and roll, making sure not to disturb any of that other extremely fragile soldering. We should be able to drop that into position. Otherwise have to go through the channel in the middle, which they're not quite doing. I need a benign poking device, big fat screwdriver. Sorry. There. That's ready to screw together.
Before I quite literally screw this up, let me remind you that in the past 3 hours and 45 minutes we have built up the scratch plate, attached the volume and tone pots, the trem block, the trem claw and springs, and prepared the jack socket for its cover. And I've done a lot of soldering. Once I've attached the scratch plate, it should all begin to look a lot more guitar-y.
What I quite like about a moment like this in the reassembly of a thing is that something that's been flapping about in a rather annoying way and in a way that offends my slight sense of order in the universe will suddenly become tight and taut and rattle-free, and, you know, it will assume some permanence. And I like that. Because I'm only putting the screws in loose, it's still got that, you know, it's not right, it's not settled, it's not happy. And there's all that wiry stuff underneath which could become tangled and broken and trapped. Terrible things like that. I also have a bit of a phobia about wires. I can't stand looking behind my desk where all the bits from the computer go. I don't like looking behind people's TVs, because if they've got a TV and a hard disk recorder and a Sky Plus box and Apple TV, all the rest of it, he's got this massive pile of wires, and whatever you do, they always end up all knotted up, and it makes me feel... I get a sort of strange pain in my teeth when I look at things like that. Oh, God, horrible. It's generally thought that you have a very long-handled screwdriver like this because you are doing something in an inaccessible place, such as getting to the adjustment screws on the carburettor of a complicated motorcycle or a deeply buried car engine. And they are very good for that, but there's another reason for using a long screwdriver if you can, which is that obviously the purchase of the screwdriver tip on the screw depends on it being exactly square. And the longer the screwdriver, the more chance you have of getting it properly lined up and exactly right. If you use a very stubby screwdriver, it's very difficult to tell if you're holding it at an angle. If you have a very long one, you know immediately, which means you get better purchase on the screw and you stand more chance of undoing a stubborn one with a long screwdriver. It's the end of interesting screwdriver facts. It's interesting that there is a tradition amongst adolescent boys in particular of playing air guitar, but you can't really do air reassembly, can you? No one ever walks around going like that. But come with me.
After collecting more bits, I screw in the strap buttons and put on the selector switch cap. I can then consider the volume and tone knobs.
I'm just thinking about how I line these up, because I just think so. You should playing a guitar, I think they should, if that's volume on effectively 0, that is tone 1, that is tone 2. So now look, if you imagine that you are the eye of the player, and you see the words the right way up to you and all square, they're all on minimum. That's volume up, that's that tone knob going clockwise and that tone knob going clockwise. Any objections? Apart from it really doesn't matter, get on with it. Right, now we're going to attach the machine heads. These are the things that will tension the strings for you, tune it, with tiny, tiny, tiny little screws. And we need the neck, and as well as the neck, we need the nut that goes onto the truss rod, which is inside it. Machine heads. 2 of them, there's one, have an extra bit on the end. That one has an extra bit on the end, and you will see why as I put them into the back of the neck. Locate them. They've each got a little pin on. There's a little hole, series of little holes there that locate those, and then little holes where the screws go in to join them all together. So there's a sort of standalone screw in the end one, and then every other screw secures 2. I'm having to use the greatest screwdriver in the world because it's the only one I have with a tip even vaguely close to that size. That's very guitar-y, isn't it, having those there? I meant to tell you earlier on, actually, about the very first experiments with solid electric guitars, as opposed to the early electric guitars, which were really acoustic guitars with electric pickups in. There's a difference between that and a completely solid one like this, where there is no acoustic amplification of the sound at all. And there was a chap in America experimented with the idea and came up with a fairly straight guitar that he called the Log, and he showed it to Gibson, the guitar makers. He was dissatisfied with the acoustic electric guitar because he thought the 2 means of amplification conflicted with each other. He showed his Log to them, and they said it looked like a broomstick with a pickup, and they didn't like it. So he went away, he actually performed with it, and the audience didn't like it either because it didn't look like a guitar. So he ended up sawing just the front off a conventional acoustic guitar and pinning it to his Log, so that it looked like a guitar, and then people liked it. And then he went back to Gibson, and after they'd studied a bit, they agreed to start making something very similar. And his name was, you've probably guessed by now, that was Les Paul. Right, we just have to put this on. Rather than try and explain what this does, we'll wait until we put the strings on, then you'll see. But this is called the string tree. I don't know why it's called the string tree, because it doesn't look like a tree, and it doesn't function like a tree. It's just called the string tree. And the slots have to be in that. There are 2 little slots underneath, and they very small, roughly the size of a string, in fact. So I'll just give that a little nip up. And then finally, before we actually attach the neck to the body, there's a metal bar running down inside. You might just be able to see the end of it in there. That's called the truss rod, which is a sort of neck pre-tensioner, if you like. On the end of that rod, it's anchored at this end. There is this special nut called the truss rod adjusting nut, or just the truss rod nut. And the point of this is that by carefully adjusting the screw, or the nut, rather, you can put a very, very minute, I mean, to be honest, almost imperceptible curve in the neck of the guitar so that the strings remain a nice distance from the frets in the middle. I need the right size screwdriver to go in there without chewing it up, which I think is that one. The reason the truss rod is in there is because without it, they discovered on early guitars, the neck would eventually bow that way because the string tension is significant over that length of what is actually not a particularly fat piece of wood. So the truss rod working between there and down here can curve the neck the other way to counteract the pull of the strings, which will tend to curve it back this way. Now, a lot of guitarists say the very faintest of bows that way is desirable, and I am told that if I set the truss rod on this so that the neck is perfectly straight, by the time the string tension is added, it will have that very, very slight, imperceptible bow the other way. So let's... Now, you see, that did make a tiny, tiny difference. In fact, I would say I have gone minutely too far, and that was only about a quarter of a turn, so I'm going to back it off about 1/16 of a turn. There you are, the ruler is touching at all points, all the frets are on the ruler. Cool. Right, let's attach it, let's get some strings on this baby. More components. These 4 screws and this plate will join the 2 halves of the guitar that we have at the moment to make a complete guitar. This is a very, very exciting and important moment. So I'm thinking about the best way of doing this, because there are opportunities for dropping everything. That's quite a tight fit, but it's still slightly nerve-wracking because there's nothing actually holding it together yet. What I'm holding in my hands is the affordable and believable dream and desperate hope of 1 billion teenagers all over the world. It's like boxing used to be to some people. It was the possibility of an escape from drudgery. The electric guitar is also the same thing. So many people buy these and hang them on their bedroom walls and learn to play them until their fingers bleed and all that stuff, in the hope and belief that it will be their salvation. In fact, Paul Weller summed the whole thing up rather nicely. To be someone must be a wonderful thing. Deep joy. Let's put some strings on it.
Five hours and 12 minutes in, and I have assembled the bridge, attached the pickups, the scratch plate, and put on the neck. It finally looks like a guitar. Now to turn this from a block of wooden wires into the devil's axe. It's time for the strings.
E, A, D, G, B, E. Should I have sung that? Now, I've got to be brutally honest, I've never done this before. I've partly built a harpsichord, but I've not done this, but I think I know the basics, so like that, it flies off and hits you directly in the plums. I didn't think it was funny. So the string goes in from the back, through the trem block, and I feel that that has located correctly, and it goes up there through that sort of, the other bridge, if you like, which is called the nut. So I would cut it off there. You should really put your fingers over the end when you do that sort of thing. I just sort of harboured a vain hope that it would hit the executive producer in the face. There's a string on the guitar, it's coming alive. What this is, I'm doing now, is sort of Pythagorean, really. This is where we get our ideas about the numerical relationships between pitches from Pythagoras, experimenting with the length of a taut string and how dividing it up by effectively having a moving bridge along its length affected the pitch. And that's how we ended up in the Middle Ages with rather academic and intellectual theories of consonance and dissonance based on numbers. It was only really in the Renaissance, in the English musical Renaissance, which is where it really started, that people decided that actually other intervals were okay because they sounded nice, namely the third, the major and minor third, which is the basis of tonality as we understand it in the modern world. I just turned the wrong one because I'm dribbling on. Anyway, there was one, I can't remember which one said it, might have been one of the anonymous scholars, said the more trebles, the more thirds that a man sings in the treble, the merrier it is. Should we talk a little bit about strings, which in the early days of stringed musical instruments were made out of, well, what used to be called catgut, but wasn't actually made from cats. It was usually made from sheep. It was their entrails and viscera twisted together and strung out. And some people who are obsessed with authentic Baroque performance, for example, will still buy or make gut strings, especially the Germans. They think they're their gut. But that was replaced by nylon, because nylon is easier to make, cheaper, and is more consistent. But of course, nylon wouldn't work with an electric guitar. You need a steel string. So these strings are steel. The bottom three are a steel core wound, whereas the top three, G, B, and E, are plain steel. I enjoyed doing that. I found that deeply satisfying. I'm in a place of great calm now. Not normally associated with electric guitars, to be honest. Shall we screw in the trem bar, put on the strap, and then we've just got to find an amp. Strap, lead, bar. Does anybody else of a certain age remember that Robert Fripp of King Crimson and Frippatronics fame? People always said of him, well, you know, he sits down to play his electric guitar. Do you remember people saying that? Because he did. He used to sit on the stool and play it. Well, I've sat down on a stool and reassembled one, which is sort of uncool, but very cool at the same time. This is prog reassembly. If you remember, we put the trem bar itself is on the back of the bridge plate inside the body, and then behind there were the springs that we attached to a mounting plate, solidly screwed to this. What that means is when you do that with the bar, you're stretching and relaxing the springs minutely. I mean, it is an imperceptible movement. You wouldn't be able to see it, but that gives you that little wah, 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 wah effect. If you really push on it, you can really bend your chord or whatever. The lead, that says so much about the second half of the 20th century. Jack plug going into an electric guitar. Bang. The kids are all right. Right, there is one of the 147 pieces of the electric guitar left. I shall go and get it. That's the final bit gone. The table is clear. Our mission is accomplished. Could we have an amplifier, please?
I've just finished reassembling the 1984 affordable Japanese copy of the classic electric guitar, which has taken me 6 hours and 11 minutes. I have built Lucifer's lute up from its 147 individual parts carefully and lovingly. Now it is time to wake up the rock gods and see if this bad boy works.
So this is exactly what the Reassembler is all about. 147 parts, including the plectrum, useless as they are as components, now rejoined and reborn as the complete electric guitar. Okay, the amp is warmed up. Cheers, Malcolm. Right.